In the stillness of the night, a 7-year-old boy trembled as he picked up the phone, his eyes filled with fear but shining with determination. On the other end of the line, a warm voice from the operator asked, "How can I help you?" The boy took a deep breath and whispered, "Sir, please save my sister. My stepfather is making her cry." Though his young heart was pounding with fear, he knew he couldn't stay silent. That call unveiled a horrifying secret, exposing the cruelty of a stepfather who seemed kind on the surface but was, in reality, a terrifying abuser. Thanks to the boy's bravery, the police intervened in time, rescuing his sister from her painful days. His small yet courageous act not only saved his sister but also proved that no matter how young or small, courage has the power to create miracles. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves outside the window. The dim glow of the street lamp barely reached the small, cramped bedroom where a young girl sat curled in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest. Her body trembled, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the terrifying sounds from the next room, shattering glass, heavy footsteps, and the sharp, angry voice that made her heart race with fear. Then came the scream. It cut through the night like a blade, raw and desperate. It wasn't her own, but her mother's. A plea for help. A cry of pain. And in that instant, something inside the girl snapped. Fear had kept her frozen for too long. She couldn't just sit there. She couldn't pretend it would stop on its own. With trembling hands, she reached for the phone. Every second felt like an eternity as she dialed, her fingers numb against the cold buttons. 911, what is your emergency? The voice on the other end was steady, calm. A lifeline in the storm. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Please, help us." The operator's voice was gentle but firm. "Stay with me. Help is on the way." In the distance, sirens began to wail, their sound growing louder, stronger, like a promise. The girl clutched the phone tighter, her pulse still frantic, but a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. The nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't alone in the dark. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. Rows of spectators leaned forward, their breaths held as if afraid to disturb the weight of the moment. At the front of the room, under the cold glow of fluorescent lights, the witness stood trembling, hands clenched together to stop them from shaking. For years, the truth had been buried, hidden beneath layers of fear, manipulation, and silence. But today, there was no more running, no more hiding. The witness took a deep breath, eyes flickering toward the defendant seated across the room. Their gaze met, and for a brief moment, the same old fear clawed at their chest. Would speaking the truth change anything? Would justice finally be served? The judge's voice broke through the tension. "Please state, in your own words, what happened." The witness swallowed hard. Their heart pounded in their ears, but they forced themselves to speak. Their voice was unsteady at first, but with each word, strength returned. They told of the lies, the deception, the betrayal. They exposed the cruelty, the pain, the scars left behind. The courtroom listened in silence, some in shock, some in sorrow. Others, who had always suspected the truth, exchanged knowing glances. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in their seat, their once confident demeanor cracking. Their lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The words had been spoken. The truth, once hidden in darkness, now stood in the light for all to see. When the testimony ended, the room remained eerily still. Then, the judge nodded solemnly. The jury exchanged glances. The weight of justice had shifted. And for the first time in years, the witness felt free. The sirens wailed through the quiet neighborhood, their piercing cries slicing through the still night air. Flames danced wildly against the dark sky, consuming the small house on the corner. Smoke billowed, thick and suffocating, as neighbors gathered in shock, whispering prayers and watching helplessly. Amid the chaos, a small figure stood frozen, eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. 12-year-old Jake knew he didn't have time to wait for the firefighters. His little sister, Emma, was still inside. He could hear her faint cries above the roar of the fire. His heart pounded as his mother clutched his arm, begging him not to go. But he couldn't stand by. Before anyone could stop him, Jake tore away and sprinted toward the burning house. The heat hit him like a wall, searing his skin and making his eyes water. He covered his nose with his sleeve and pushed forward, forcing himself through the thick smoke. Every step was agony, but his sister's cries guided him like a beacon. "Emma," he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the crackling flames. A small whimper answered him. He followed the sound to the corner of the living room, where Emma crouched, clutching her stuffed bunny. Her tear-streaked face was filled with terror. Jake dropped to his knees, ignoring the scorching heat around them. "It's okay, I've got you." He scooped her up, holding her close as he turned back toward the door. The flames had spread, licking at the walls and blocking their path. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, but he refused to give up. Then, he saw it, a small gap near the kitchen window. It was their only chance. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jake ran, shielding Emma with his body as he pushed through the smoke. With one final leap, he crashed through the window, landing hard on the damp grass outside. The crowd gasped. His mother screamed his name and rushed forward, gathering them both into her trembling arms. The firefighters arrived seconds later, taking over as Jake coughed, struggling to catch his breath. "You're a hero, kid," one of the firefighters said, ruffling his soot-covered hair. Jake looked down at Emma, who clung to him tightly. He wasn't thinking about being a hero, he had just done what he had to do. As his mother held them close, tears of relief streaming down her face, Jake realized something. He had been scared, more scared than he had ever been in his life. But courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about acting, even when fear threatened to stop you. And tonight, that courage had saved a life. It was late in the afternoon when the first smoke began to rise into the air, drifting through the neighborhood like a warning. By the time the full extent of the fire became clear, the house was already engulfed in flames. The fiery glow illuminated the darkening sky, casting long shadows over the street. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood, and the sound of crackling flames filled the night. 10-year-old Max stood frozen on the sidewalk, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands trembled, the world around him spinning in a haze of heat and confusion. His eyes were locked on the inferno that had once been his home. His mind raced, but there was only one thing he could think of: his little sister, Lily, was still inside. Max had always been protective of Lily, ever since she was born. She was small and quiet, often lost in her own world of books and toys, and he had taken it upon himself to be her protector. He had promised their parents that he would always look out for her, but now, faced with the reality of the fire, Max felt an overwhelming surge of fear. "Max." His mother's voice pulled him out of his daze. She was standing at the curb, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You need to stay back. The firemen are here, they're going to take care of it." But Max couldn't stay back. He couldn't stand there and do nothing while Lily was still inside. The thought of her alone, scared, and trapped in that burning house was more than he could bear. He had to go in. He had to save her. "Max, no! Stay with me," his mother pleaded, grabbing his arm. But Max jerked away, his eyes wild with desperation. "I have to go," he shouted, barely recognizing the voice that came from his lips. Without waiting for a response, he ran toward the house. The heat hit him like a wave, making it difficult to breathe. The fire roared like a wild animal, devouring everything in its path. Max's heart raced as he ran closer to the flames. His mind was a blur, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the house that had once been his sanctuary. As he reached the front steps, he hesitated for a moment, trying to catch his breath. The fire had already spread so quickly. The windows were cracked and shattered, the heat unbearable. But there was no time to waste. He couldn't think, couldn't wait. Lily needed him. Max pushed open the door, but the heat was overwhelming. It took all of his strength to keep from collapsing. The smoke was thick, burning his lungs with every breath, and his eyes watered, making it difficult to see. But he didn't care. He only had one goal in mind: find Lily. Lily! Max yelled, his voice hoarse. Lily, where are you? There was no answer, just the roaring of the flames and the crackling of the burning house. Max's chest tightened, and his stomach churned with fear. He stumbled through the living room, the floorboards beneath his feet creaking, the walls hot to the touch. He called again, his voice breaking. Finally, in the corner of the kitchen, he saw her. Lily was crouched beneath the table, hugging her knees to her chest. Her face was streaked with tears, her little body shaking with fear. She looked up when she heard his voice, her eyes wide and filled with panic. Max, she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared. I want to go home. Max felt his heart shatter at the sight of her, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knelt down beside her, his hands trembling. Lily, we have to get out of here, he said softly, his voice as steady as he could make it. I'm going to get you out of here, okay? Lily nodded, but she didn't move. Max could see the fear in her eyes, the terror that had frozen her in place. He reached out, lifting her into his arms. She was light, but the weight of the situation was heavy on him. The smoke was thickening, and every second felt like an eternity. He had to get her to safety. Max stood up, his legs shaking, but he refused to stop. He turned toward the front door, but it was blocked by flames. Panic surged through him as he realized he couldn't go the way he came. The smoke was suffocating, and the heat was unbearable, but he couldn't let Lily down. He looked around, his eyes scanning for another way out. His gaze landed on the back window. It was small, but it was their only chance. With determination, he pushed through the smoke and made his way to the kitchen. He kicked open the window, the glass shattering under the force. Lily, we have to climb through the window, he said urgently, his voice cracking. Can you do it? Lily nodded, her face pale but determined. Max helped her through first, his heart in his throat. Once she was safely outside, he crawled through after her, his arms burning as he pushed himself through the small opening. The fresh air hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he just sat there, gasping for breath. Lily clung to him, her small hands gripping his shirt. Max held her close, his own heart still racing in his chest. They were safe. They had made it. Their mother was already outside, her arms outstretched, tears streaming down her face. She ran to them, pulling them both into a tight embrace. Oh, Max, thank God, she cried, her voice full of relief. You saved her. You saved both of you. Max didn't answer. He was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what had just happened. But as he looked down at Lily, still in his arms, he realized something. He may have been small, but in that moment, he had been the hero his sister needed. It was a chilly evening in late autumn, the streets quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves caught in the wind. The night was creeping in, the sky turning darker, and the street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows along the road. For Sarah, it was another ordinary evening spent walking home from work. She had grown used to the long walk in the quiet neighborhood, each step feeling like the calm before the storm. But that evening was different. As she turned the corner onto her street, Sarah paused. There was something off about the stillness tonight. The air was thick, charged with an unfamiliar tension. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a deep unease gnawing at her, urging her to turn back. But curiosity kept her going. She pressed on, her steps tentative but determined, feeling a strange pull to the building on the corner. It was the old house, the one that had stood abandoned for as long as Sarah could remember. People had long whispered about it, the crumbling facade, the windows that seemed to watch you, the eerie feeling that never quite left the place. She had never paid it much attention, but tonight, something was different. Tonight, it felt alive. A sound, a soft cry, pierced through the quiet. It was distant at first, almost a whisper, but unmistakably human. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound was faint but persistent, coming from somewhere within the old house. She couldn't quite place it, but it was unmistakable. A cry for help. Her mind raced. Who could be inside? The house had been empty for years. Had someone moved in? Or was it just the wind playing tricks on her? She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just a figment of her imagination. But the voice, weak and strained, came again. Help, please. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in there. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away from the house as possible, but something deep inside her kept her rooted in place. She couldn't just walk away, not when someone was in need. Her hands shook as she approached the front door, which was ajar, as though waiting for her to enter. The air was thick with dust and decay, the smell of mildew heavy in her nose. Sarah hesitated, her mind battling between fear and the need to help. But she couldn't ignore the voice, the desperate, pleading cry that echoed in her ears. She had to go in. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound making her heart race faster. The hallway inside was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners. It was cold, far colder than it should have been for a late autumn evening. She could feel her breath coming out in visible puffs, her skin crawling with unease. But she forced herself forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The voice came again, this time louder, more distinct, filled with pain and fear. Please, someone help me. It was coming from upstairs. Sarah's heart clenched at the sound. Without thinking, she rushed up the creaking stairs, her hands shaking as she gripped the railing. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, and she could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. The house seemed to groan under its own weight, as if it was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. At the top of the stairs, Sarah found herself in a long hallway, lined with closed doors. The cry for help was clearer now, coming from the farthest room at the end. She was trembling, her legs heavy, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know who it was, what was happening. Pushing open the door, Sarah found herself in a room that appeared untouched by time, its contents covered in dust and webs. In the center, however, was a small, old-fashioned crib, an unsettling sight in the midst of the dilapidated room. And there, lying motionless in the crib, was a doll, its porcelain face cracked and eyes wide open. Sarah's breath hitched as she realized the cry was not coming from the doll but from something behind it. She turned around, her mind racing, as her eyes landed on a figure in the far corner of the room. A woman, hunched over and bound by ropes, her face covered in dirt, her eyes wide with terror. Please, the woman gasped, her voice barely audible. Help me. The sight sent a chill through Sarah's bones. The woman's clothes were torn, her body frail and weak, as if she had been held captive for far too long. Her eyes locked onto Sarah's, pleading, desperate, as if she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to come for her. Sarah's heart broke at the sight of her. Without thinking, Sarah rushed to her side, her hands trembling as she untied the ropes binding the woman's wrists. I'm here. I'm going to get you out of here, she whispered, her voice shaky but full of resolve. But as she worked, she could feel something change in the room. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, and Sarah's instincts screamed at her to leave. Thank you so much, the woman whispered, her voice hoarse with gratitude. But then, a terrible realization hit Sarah, a gut-wrenching truth she hadn't wanted to admit. No one had been looking for this woman. She had been here for so long, crying for help, and yet no one had come. No one had heard her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the woman's haunted eyes. The world outside had forgotten about her. Left her to suffer, alone, with no one to hear her cries. As Sarah helped the woman to her feet, the room seemed to close in around them. The shadows grew darker, the wind howling through the broken windows. It was as though the house itself was angry that they had come. The woman's grip tightened around Sarah's arm, and for a moment, their eyes locked in silent understanding. They were not just escaping the house. They were escaping a long-forgotten truth, a truth that had been buried for years, as the cries of those in need faded into the silence, ignored, abandoned. As Sarah led the woman toward the door, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for all the forgotten cries, the ones that echoed unanswered in the dark corners of the world. Would anyone ever remember them? Would anyone ever hear them? But for now, Sarah had done what no one else had. She had heard the cry for help. And that, at least, was something. It was a night unlike any other. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the quiet town. A cold breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, and the street lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the deserted streets. Amelia pulled her coat tighter around her body, the chill seeping through despite the layers. She had always loved the calm of these late-night walks, but tonight there was a sense of unease creeping under her skin, like a persistent whisper she couldn't shake off. She was nearing her destination, a house she had passed many times before, but never quite noticed. The place had always seemed a bit out of place, with its broken windows and sagging roof. Yet, tonight, it seemed different. The house looked darker than she remembered, as though the shadows had deepened, pulling the entire building into their embrace. A strange pull seemed to beckon her forward, despite her better judgment. As she approached the old, weather-beaten door, a shiver ran down her spine. The house stood in silence, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. Amelia hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. What was it about this house that drew her in? Why did it feel as if it were calling to her? She couldn't explain it, but her feet seemed to move of their own accord, bringing her closer to the door. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the cold brass doorknob. It felt heavier than she expected, as though it were resisting her touch, reluctant to allow her entry. With a deep breath, Amelia turned the knob. The door creaked loudly in protest, the sound echoing through the quiet night. She winced at the noise, but it was too late to turn back now. The door swung open slowly, revealing the dark interior of the house. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of decay and neglect heavy in the air. A faint sound echoed from within, a soft scraping noise that sent a chill crawling up her spine. It was as though the house itself was alive, groaning under the weight of years of abandonment. Amelia stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread but couldn't bring herself to leave. The darkness within the house seemed to draw her in, pulling her deeper with each step. The walls, once white, were now stained with age, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. She couldn't help but notice the shadows, how they seemed to shift and move just out of the corner of her eye. It was as though something, or someone, was lurking in the dark, watching her. She made her way down the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The scraping sound grew louder, more pronounced, until it seemed to surround her. It was coming from behind a door at the end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light. Amelia's curiosity, despite the fear gnawing at her, pushed her forward. The door was ajar, just enough for her to see a sliver of what lay beyond. Her hand, almost involuntarily, reached out toward it. She pushed the door open with a creak, her breath hitching in her throat. Inside, the room was pitch black, save for a single candle that flickered weakly on a dusty table. Shadows danced across the walls, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure in the corner, hunched over, its back to her. Amelia froze. The scraping sound intensified, now unmistakably the sound of nails dragging across the wooden floor. A voice, faint and hoarse, whispered from the darkness. "Help, help me!" Her blood ran cold. The voice was fragile, broken, almost as though it was pleading for mercy. Amelia's body went rigid, her heart thudding in her chest. She should leave. She should turn around and run. But the voice, so desperate, so pained, held her in place. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no immediate response. The room fell silent, the air thick and oppressive. But then, just as she was about to step back, the figure in the corner moved. Slowly, deliberately. The figure turned toward her, revealing a face so pale, so gaunt, that it took everything within Amelia to stay rooted in place. The face was twisted in an expression of agony, its hollow eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at her. The figure's lips parted, and once again, the voice came, rasping and faint. "Please, help me." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She took a hesitant step forward, despite the voice in her head screaming at her to run, to get out of the house. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening here. As she stepped closer, the figure moved again, its body jerking unnaturally, as though it were being pulled by invisible strings. The air in the room grew colder, the darkness thicker. The candle flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into complete blackness. Amelia's pulse raced as she stood in the pitch-black room, the sound of scraping nails now surrounding her, closing in from all sides. She could no longer hear the voice, but the weight of the figure's presence pressed down on her, suffocating her. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, sending a chill down her spine. Amelia gasped as she felt a cold hand brush against her arm, its touch icy and unyielding. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, the shadows closing in once more. Panicked, Amelia backed toward the door, but the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, blocking her escape. She stumbled, her heart racing, her mind overwhelmed with terror. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was everywhere, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the house fell silent. The shadows receded, the air cleared, and the oppressive weight lifted. Amelia found herself standing in the dark room, her heart still pounding in her chest, her body trembling. The figure was gone. The room was empty. But the sense of dread, the feeling that something terrible had just happened, remained. She turned, ready to run, to escape the nightmare she had just witnessed. But as she reached for the door, she froze. The door had closed behind her. And on the other side, she could hear the faintest whisper. "Stay with me." Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the darkness once again began to close in. The house had not let her go. And in the silence, the real horror began. The courthouse stood tall, its stone walls an imposing symbol of authority and truth. Yet, within its halls, the air was thick with tension. Today was not just another case, it was a moment that would define the lives of many. Amelia stood at the front of the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She was the one who had uncovered the truth. She was the one who had fought tirelessly to bring the truth to light. Now, she was about to stand before the judge, ready to present the final piece of evidence that would reveal the true culprit behind a series of unspeakable crimes. She had known from the beginning that this battle would not be easy. The legal system was full of loopholes and manipulations, and the people she was up against were powerful, people who thought they could get away with anything. But Amelia wasn't one to back down. She had spent years following the trail, piecing together fragments of information that others had overlooked. Every late night, every ounce of energy spent had led to this moment, and she would not let it slip away. Her thoughts drifted to the victims. Innocent lives lost, families torn apart, their cries for justice echoing in her mind. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she thought of them. She wasn't just fighting for the truth, she was fighting for them. She had seen their grief, felt their pain, and now, it was time to give them the closure they so desperately needed. The judge, a stern man named Judge Harrison, looked down at her, his cold, calculating eyes scrutinizing every move she made. He had been through countless cases, and his expression was always the same, unflinching, impartial. But today, as he waited for Amelia to speak, there was something in his gaze. A flicker of anticipation, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would prevail. Amelia stood tall, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, I stand before you today not only as a legal advocate but as someone who believes in the power of justice. I have gathered the evidence, the testimony, the facts that will bring an end to this cycle of lies. The truth has been hidden for too long, but today, it will no longer be silenced." The courtroom fell silent, every eye on her. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the eyes of the jury, the families of the victims, the lawyers on the opposing side. But there was no fear in her heart. Only resolve. She turned to face the jury, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the 12 men and women who would decide the fate of the accused. They were ordinary people, citizens like her, who had been called to this moment, to serve as the voice of justice. Amelia took a deep breath and continued, her words carrying the power of everything she had worked for. The defendant, Mr. James Patterson, has tried to manipulate the system, to hide behind wealth and influence. He has tried to bury the truth beneath layers of lies. But I am here today to make sure that justice is not for sale. I present to you the evidence, the fingerprints found at the crime scene, the surveillance footage that was tampered with, and the testimony of those who dared to speak the truth. She could feel the tension in the room, but she pressed on. The truth is not always easy to hear. It is not always convenient. But it is always the right thing. Mr. Patterson thought he could escape, that he could walk free while others paid the price for his actions. But today, that ends. Today, we stand together to give a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Amelia felt the weight of her words, the responsibility of them, but she also felt something else, a quiet, determined strength. She wasn't just speaking for the victims anymore. She was speaking for herself, for every person who had ever been silenced, for every truth that had been buried in the shadows. The voice of justice was loud, and it would not be ignored. As she finished speaking, Amelia returned to her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The judge looked at her, his expression unreadable, before he nodded slowly, signaling for the defense to present their case. But Amelia knew she had done what needed to be done. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. The rest of the trial unfolded in a blur of motions and counterarguments, but Amelia's mind stayed focused. She could feel the presence of the victims with her, their spirits urging her forward. They were no longer just memories, they were part of her fight, part of the fight for justice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the moment arrived. The jury had deliberated, and the courtroom held its collective breath as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Your Honor, we, the jury, find the defendant, James Patterson, guilty of all charges. The words echoed through the room, and Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her. The battle was won, but it wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for those who had been lost in the shadows, for those whose voices had been silenced. The truth had triumphed. Justice had been served. As the judge banged his gavel, declaring the trial officially closed, Amelia stood, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had fought for justice, and today, she had succeeded. The darkness that had lingered over the victims, the community, and herself had been lifted. The truth was no longer buried. It was free, loud, and clear for all to hear. And as she walked out of the courthouse, she knew one thing for sure: the voice of justice had been heard, and it would never be silenced again. The morning light struggled to break through the thick clouds as Rachel stood at the edge of the small, cluttered police station. Her hands gripped the worn leather of her briefcase, a tangible weight that felt like it was filled with a lifetime of burden. The case she had been working on for months now rested heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't just any case. It was a case that had shattered families, turned lives upside down, and left a trail of destruction across the city. And it all pointed to one man, Frank Mitchell. As Rachel entered the building, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. The officers at their desks barely glanced up as she passed, each lost in their own thoughts. The hum of muted conversations, the tapping of keyboards, and the shuffle of paperwork filled the background, but Rachel's focus was singular. She had to bring Mitchell to justice. The darkness he had unleashed on the world couldn't be ignored any longer. Inside the interrogation room, the air was colder than she expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an almost unnatural pallor over the man sitting at the table. Frank Mitchell, wearing a crisp suit, his hair combed back, and his eyes cold as steel, looked every bit the image of a man who had carefully crafted his persona for years. But Rachel knew better. She knew the man across from her wasn't the charming businessman he pretended to be. He wasn't the upstanding citizen the world had thought him to be. He was a monster. As she took her seat, Mitchell's eyes flickered with amusement, as if he had already won. "Detective Scott," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "What a pleasure to see you again." Rachel didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a long breath, letting the silence stretch between them. Mitchell was testing her, trying to get under her skin. He had done it before, and he was good at it. But Rachel wasn't going to let him have the upper hand. Not today. You've been running from the truth for too long, Mr. Mitchell, Rachel finally spoke, her voice steady but firm. But I'm not here to play games. I'm here to show you that no matter how much you try to hide, the truth will come out. Mitchell's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but it was enough. Rachel could see the flicker of fear that flashed in his eyes. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. And she was going to make sure of that. I don't know what you're talking about, Mitchell replied, leaning back in his chair with a practiced nonchalance. I've done nothing wrong. You can't prove anything. Rachel slid a thick folder across the table toward him. The papers inside were filled with damning evidence, photographs of his connections to the criminal underworld, financial transactions that linked him to illegal operations, and, most importantly, testimonies from those who had been silenced for too long. But Rachel knew it wasn't just the evidence that would bring him down. It was his arrogance. His belief that he was above it all. She watched as he flipped through the papers, his eyes briefly scanning the words. There was no sign of the shock she had expected. Mitchell was not a man who feared consequences. He had played this game for too long. But Rachel had the one thing he couldn't anticipate, she had the truth, and it was far more dangerous than any illusion he had built. You can look at those all you want, Rachel said, her voice low but filled with an edge of steel. But you know as well as I do that the truth is inescapable. We know what you've done, Frank. We know about the people you've destroyed, the lives you've ruined. It's all there. In black and white. And you're not getting away this time. For the first time since she entered the room, Mitchell's expression wavered. He clenched his jaw, the tightness in his face revealing the facade that had crumbled beneath the weight of her words. But still, he fought back, his voice dripping with venom. You think you're going to win this? He sneered. You think you can take me down? I'm untouchable. I've always been untouchable. Rachel met his gaze directly, her eyes unwavering. You're not untouchable, Frank. You're a coward hiding behind a mask. And today, that mask comes off. The tension in the room was palpable as Rachel leaned forward, her tone shifting from anger to determination. You've spent your whole life manipulating people, playing them like puppets. But you've underestimated one thing, you've underestimated me. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Mitchell's eyes narrowed, the smug confidence he had once carried slowly slipping away. Rachel could see it now, the cracks in his carefully constructed world. She had done what no one else had done before. She had shattered the illusion he had built for himself. The door behind them opened, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the room. Officer Thomas, one of Rachel's most trusted colleagues, stepped inside, holding a file in his hands. Without saying a word, he handed it to Rachel. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the documents before locking eyes with Mitchell again. The final piece of the puzzle, she said quietly. We've got you now. Mitchell's face went pale, the arrogance completely drained from him. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of seconds. For the first time, Rachel saw the man who was truly hiding behind all of the lies, the man who had terrified so many, the man who had thought he could escape justice forever. But there was no escaping now. As Rachel stood up and turned toward the door, she felt a sense of finality settle over her. Frank Mitchell's reign of terror was over. He had thought he could outsmart everyone, that he could manipulate the system. But Rachel had seen through it all. She had exposed the monster hiding behind the mask. And now, for the first time in years, the people he had harmed would have their voices heard. The truth had been uncovered. Justice was coming, and it was coming for him. As Rachel walked out of the room, she could hear the sound of Mitchell's chair scraping against the floor as he stood. But it didn't matter anymore. His time was up. The portrait of evil had been painted, and the world would finally see it. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the horizon, as Emily sat quietly at her desk. The sound of her pen scraping against the paper echoed softly in the otherwise silent room. She had been writing for hours, but her mind was miles away, lost in the memories of a past that still haunted her. It had been years since the incident, yet the feeling of loss, the unanswered questions, and the faces of those who had disappeared without a trace still lingered in her thoughts. Her pen stopped moving. She stared at the page, the words she had written appearing meaningless in the face of the overwhelming emotions inside her. The case had never been solved. The people who had vanished, their stories left untold. Emily had devoted herself to finding the truth, but she couldn't help but feel like she was chasing shadows. And today, she had received a phone call, a call that might change everything. The voice on the other end had been familiar, but not one she had heard in years. It was Marcus, her former partner, someone she had once trusted implicitly. He had been the one to pull her out of the wreckage of their previous cases, the one who had shared her frustrations and victories. But after that fateful night, he had disappeared too, just like the others. The call had been brief, but the words still echoed in her mind. Emily, there's something you need to know. It's time to finish what we started. Her heart raced as she remembered the urgency in his voice. There had been no explanation, no details, just a promise of answers if she was willing to risk it all. She had been hesitant, but a part of her, the part that had never stopped looking for closure, knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. This could be the key to unlocking everything. She grabbed her coat and left her apartment, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her chest. The streets were bustling with activity, but Emily felt a strange sense of isolation. People moved around her, their lives continuing on as if nothing had changed. But for her, the world was on the edge of something big, something that could either bring her peace or destroy everything she had worked for. She arrived at the meeting place just as the sky darkened. It was an old cafe at the corner of an unfamiliar street, the kind of place people used to go to hide from the world. She stood in front of it for a moment, hesitant. Could she really trust Marcus after everything that had happened? After all the years of silence, was he still the man she had once known? The doubts gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside. She had come too far to turn back now. Inside, the dim lights and the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted her. The cafe was nearly empty, except for a lone figure sitting in the corner booth. It was Marcus. His face was older, worn by time and the weight of their past, but his eyes were still the same, sharp, calculating, and filled with something Emily couldn't quite place. He looked up as she approached, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But there was no warmth in his expression, only the coldness of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Emily sat down across from him, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as the tension between them thickened. "You're late," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't know if I could trust you," Emily replied, her words coming out more harshly than she intended. "After everything, why now? Why contact me after all these years?" Marcus leaned back in his seat, his gaze unwavering. "Because I found something. Something you won't believe." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had heard these words before, people promising answers, only to lead her further down a path of confusion and despair. But there was something in his tone, something in the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, that told her he wasn't lying this time. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for anyone who might be listening. When he spoke again, it was with a sense of urgency. "The disappearances, they're connected. It's all part of something bigger. And the person behind it all, Emily, it's someone you know." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. Someone she knew? She shook her head, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What are you talking about? Who?" Marcus paused, then slid a small envelope across the table. Emily opened it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of a man she recognized immediately, David, a former colleague, someone she had trusted, someone who had vanished without a trace along with the others. But there was something wrong about the photo. David's face had been altered, his eyes hollow, and there was a sinister energy in the air around him. "This," Marcus said, his voice thick with tension, "is the link. David is involved. And he's the one who's been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. David? The man who had been a mentor to her, who had once guided her through some of her darkest moments. The idea was inconceivable. But why? Emily whispered, her mind racing. Why would David be involved in something like this? What's the purpose? Marcus's gaze hardened. I don't know yet. But I intend to find out. And you're going to help me. Emily stared at the photograph, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. She had spent so many years searching for answers, trying to uncover the truth behind the disappearances. But now, it seemed the truth was more complex, more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The link between her past and the people she had lost was now clearer, but it also meant that everything she had believed in was about to be shattered. As the last light of day faded, Emily felt the first stirrings of a storm within her. The truth was out there, but it was buried deep beneath layers of deception and betrayal. She had no choice but to follow the path Marcus had set before her. It was the only way to find the answers she had been seeking for so long. And as she looked at the photograph one last time, she made a silent vow: she would uncover the full truth, no matter the cost. This was no longer just about the missing people. It was about her, about the connection that had bound her to the darkness all these years. And now, she would find out just how deep the link truly went. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Every eye in the room was trained on the small figure standing nervously at the witness stand. Her hands were trembling, and she gripped the edges of the wooden surface with a desperation that belied her age. At only 8 years old, Lily had no idea how to navigate the complexity of the situation that had brought her here. She was just a child, yet the weight of her testimony could change everything. Her big, brown eyes shifted toward the crowd, and she shrank back into her seat. It was too much. Too many people, too many questions, too many stares. But she had to do this. She had to speak. She had to be brave for him. For her brother. A soft whisper from her lawyer, a comforting voice she barely recognized, reminded her to focus. Lily, it's okay. You don't have to be scared. Just tell us what you saw. You're safe here. But even the warmth of the voice didn't erase the chill running down her spine. She thought of her brother, Jason, and the terrifying events that had led to this day. She thought of the night he had been taken. The night their world had shattered. Lily had been in her room, playing with her dolls, when the shouting started. She had heard their father's voice, deep and angry, and her mother's, trembling and pleading. But it wasn't until she heard the crash of glass that she knew something was wrong. That's when the door to her room had opened, and Jason had rushed in, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. They're coming, Lily, he had whispered urgently. We have to hide. Quick! Before she could ask what was happening, Jason had grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the closet. She didn't know why he was so scared, but she trusted him. She always did. They huddled together in the dark, their bodies pressed against one another as they held their breath, listening to the sounds outside their room. The footsteps. The voices. The shouting. And then, silence. When Jason had finally opened the closet door and stepped out, Lily followed him, her small feet stumbling as they crossed the hallway. The living room was a mess, the furniture overturned, and the glass from the broken window glittering across the floor like sharp shards of ice. Her heart had started to race when she saw the bloodstains on the carpet. She didn't know whose blood it was, but it made her stomach twist in a way she couldn't explain. Jason's face had been pale as he carefully checked the house for signs of anyone else. But there was no one. No one except for the quiet, eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Jason had been the first to leave, but not without a promise. Stay hidden, Lily. Don't come out until I come back for you. Don't trust anyone else. And then he had gone, disappearing into the night. Lily had stayed hidden, too terrified to leave, her small heart pounding in her chest. She had waited for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of him. But it wasn't Jason's footsteps she heard. It was someone else's. Someone she didn't recognize. Someone who had come into their house with a sense of purpose, a cruel intention she couldn't understand. The next thing Lily remembered was being pulled out of the closet by a stranger's hand, a rough, calloused grip that dug into her wrist, pulling her into the cold night. She had struggled, cried for her brother, but the man just smiled cruelly and shoved her into the back of a van. It wasn't until they were far from home that she had realized she wasn't alone. There were other children, just like her, looking lost and afraid, none of them speaking, all of them staring at the floor. She remembered how the cold air had burned her cheeks as she sat in the van, wondering where Jason was and whether he was okay. She didn't understand why she was being taken, but she knew one thing for sure: she had to find her brother. Lily's testimony now, as she sat before the judge and jury, was the culmination of everything she had lived through in the past few weeks. Her voice quivered as she spoke, recounting the events she had witnessed in fragmented bursts. But every word she uttered sent shockwaves through the courtroom, painting a picture of horror and confusion that no one in the room could ignore. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the defense table. She could see the man sitting there, his face expressionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. She remembered his voice, calm and insistent, as he had threatened her earlier. "If you tell anyone what happened, I'll make sure you never see your brother again." Her stomach churned at the memory, but she knew she couldn't let that stop her. Jason was counting on her. Her parents were counting on her. And most importantly, the other children in that van, the ones who had suffered the same fate, were counting on her. The defense lawyer stood, attempting to discredit Lily's testimony. He spoke in a slow, measured tone, as if trying to wear her down. "Lily," he said, his voice soft, "you're just a little girl. Do you really understand the seriousness of the accusations you're making? Are you sure about what you saw? How can we trust you?" But Lily didn't falter. She had seen the truth. She had lived it. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I saw the man who took me. I know who he is. And I'm telling the truth. He took me and my brother. He hurt us." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Her words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. The jury, the lawyers, the judge, everyone was listening intently now, not daring to break the moment. Lily's heart was racing, but she didn't look away from the defendant. She had to be brave. She had to keep speaking. For Jason. For the other children. For herself. The defense lawyer tried once more to shake her confidence, but Lily knew the truth now. She had seen it with her own eyes, and nothing could change that. The man who had taken her was guilty. And she wasn't going to let fear stop her from speaking the truth anymore. "I know what I saw," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I know what happened to my brother. And I'm not afraid anymore." With those words, Lily's testimony was complete. And in that moment, she felt a shift, a sense of power she had never known before. The truth had been spoken, and no one could silence her now.